Good evening. That's on? Yes, that's right. My name's Professor Jenny Shaw and I'm Executive Dean of the Faculty of Arts here at the University of Adelaide. So I'd first like to acknowledge the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the land on which the University of Adelaide's campuses here at North Terrace and at Theberton, Waite and Roseworthy are built. Welcome everyone to this evening's Research Tuesdays event. As many of you already know, this year the Research Tuesdays program is incorporating a series of inaugural lectures. Some of them are a little delayed, and Amanda's is one of those. These lectures are held to mark a major milestone in our researchers' careers, such as achieving the rank of professor or of being appointed to a chair or other distinguished professorship. So tonight we welcome Professor Amanda Nettlebeck, who is a professor in the School of Humanities here at the University of Adelaide. Her research centres on the history and historical memory of the settler colonial frontier and the colonial governance of Indigenous people. She's co-authored 3 books with her University of Adelaide colleague Rob Foster on the Australian frontier, and their latest collaborative book with Russell Smandich and Lewis Nafka is entitled Fragile Settlements, Aboriginal Peoples, Law and Resistance in Southwest Australia and Prairie Canada, which is forthcoming early next year from University of British Columbia Press. Amanda is currently working on 2 research projects supported by the Australian Research Council. And the first of those is called Protection and Punishment, Colonial Networks and the Legal Reform of Indigenous People, on which Amanda is the chief investigator, sole investigator. And the second project is entitled Intimacy and Violence in Anglo-Pacific Rim Settler Colonial Societies, on which Amanda is co-investigator, and that grant is led by the University of Newcastle. On top of all that, Amanda is head of the Department of English and Creative Writing in the School of Humanities and has just stepped down as deputy head of the School of Humanities. Now, I know you're all waiting for her to talk, so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Amanda. Thank you.
Is that okay? Can you hear me? Oh yes, it's quite loud. Thank you very much, Jenny. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're meeting on Kaurna land and the ongoing importance of their culture and heritage. And I'd also like to acknowledge the collaborators with whom I've worked in this area of colonial history for a long time. Firstly, Robert Foster from the History Department here, my colleague, with whom I've been writing for about 15 years on the settler frontier, and we've worked on 4 book projects together and had lots of field trips. Our Canadian colleagues, Russell and Lou, who Jenny just mentioned, with whom we've just co-authored a book, and more recently my colleagues from the University of Newcastle and Tasmania, Lyndall Ryan, Vicky Haskins, Penny Edmonds and Anna Johnston, with whom I'm engaged on the Colonial Violence and Intimacy project. And I'd also like to particularly thank the historians who've worked with me as research assistants on the last 2 projects, Mike Harding and Sky Krikow, who I think are both here. I saw Mike a little bit before, whose support's been really invaluable, so thank you, Mike and Sky. Just as a cautionary note, I want to mention that the talk today includes a small number of images of unidentified Aboriginal people from the late 19th century, and one of those images is a bit confronting, so I'm just making a note of that. Also that I'm going to use the term native sometimes, but only when quoting from colonial records, so obviously now that's not a term that we would use. And on that note, with some of us here have just come from the Faculty of Arts Indigenous Research Forum, where Associate Professor Veronica Arbin was talking about the differences between Western Indigenous knowledges. So, I mean, I think everybody here would be aware that colonial archives talk almost entirely from a Western perspective and are notoriously blind to Indigenous perspectives, but we might read them against the grain to try and understand at least the hidden Aboriginal perspective in those archives. But these sorts of fraught colonial histories that I'm going to be talking about today are also, of course, often kept alive from region to region in Indigenous oral histories. Now, in recent years, we've seen a lot of public interest in the history of violence between Aboriginal people and settlers on Australia's colonial frontiers, and this is a debate in the public domain that's had really an enormous impact on how we now think about the national past. You'll see that I've put in a quick plug for our latest book, Fragile Settlements, which is in print, not in press, but we've got a cover. But there is a huge scholarship of a generation old that looks at the nature of Australia's frontier in terms of its military experience, its equivalence to warfare. Many of you will know the name of Henry Reynolds, a very famous Australian historian, and he's been really at the forefront for almost 40 years of an effort to bring this idea of frontier warfare to light and to make it recognisable in terms of equivalence to other kinds of wars fought offshore. His last book, Forgotten War, was just published last year, by no coincidence, in the middle of national commemorations around World War I, and so reviving that argument that he and others have been arguing for some years about recognising the equivalence of our frontier warfares and having that recognised in a national forum like the Canberra National War Memorial, and that's a debate that's been going on for quite some time. Now, the frontier wars that were fought on Australia's frontiers were either played out as covert affrays or skirmishes between settlers and Aboriginal groups, or it was tacitly sanctioned in paramilitary policing campaigns by colonial governments. And both those aspects of frontier violence have been very controversial in the public domain in recent years. And as part of that debate, it's been seen as though this has been an invisible history that's only now coming to light. But in fact, throughout the 19th century, this was far from a hidden topic. It was debated from the beginning of the colonial period to the very end of the 19th century in not just private memoirs, but official documentation in every Australian colony. Despite an official position, at least after the 1830s, that Aboriginal people were deemed British subjects in the eyes of the law, colonial observers frequently talked about warfare between Aboriginal people and settlers as being the true state of relations. So this recent historiography on Australia's frontier wars and its influence in public debates has really just revived an attention to the frontier wars that was visible throughout the 19th century and which recognised violence as an underpinning to colonial settlement. Another impact that historiography has had is that it's brought back into view the central place of Aboriginal people as historical agents. So it's been quite important in redressing an historical orthodoxy built up through the 20th century that saw the figure of the lone pioneer as the one that carved out the nation from an apparently empty landscape, as depicted in this very famous painting by Frederick McCubbin from around the Federation period. And as we saw in that first image by Samuel Calvert, in fact, the landscape was full of fraught conflict. But this model of frontier warfare isn't the only lens through which colonial histories of race relations have been reconsidered over the past generation. A parallel body of work has reconceived race relations on Australia's frontiers in terms of more positive kinds of connection and exchange between Aboriginal people and settlers, and it's explored all the ways in which, despite unequal relationships of power, Aboriginal people remained on their own land, took up indispensable places within colonial economies, and in a sense accommodated their traditional worlds around new kinds of cultural affiliations with settlers. So there's these two models of historiography of the frontier as a site of conflict, as a site of exchange and accommodation. And certainly these aren't at odds with each other. They're not contradictory, but we might see them instead as emphasising different ends of a fluid colonial culture where violence and intimacy were just 2 points, if you like, along a spectrum of encounters or possible encounters between Aboriginal people and incoming Europeans. So these models of the frontier, of a conflicted and a connected frontier, they certainly overlap. But at the same time, they're not typically brought together within discussions about the nature of colonial violence. And that's, I guess, really what I want to do today by looking more closely at the conditions that bred violence between settlers and Aboriginal people on a shared frontier of cross-cultural interconnectedness, in order to consider what kinds of legal responses were triggered when frontier violence occurred not as covert battles or secret battles between strangers who came together from across two sides of a divided frontier, but violence that occurred at close range between people who were known to one another. Now, this is certainly a question that could and does open onto the gendered nature of frontier violence, because as colonial officials were often very aware, the assumption of white men that they could just take Aboriginal women without, consent or reciprocity was often a source of interracial conflict and often led to violence on Australia's frontiers. But today, that's not actually going to be my focus. I'm going to focus on frontier violence in the more conventional sense of territorial conflict, both a kind of bigger scale clashes and small kind of individual episodic clashes, but talk about that in the context of protagonists who were familiar to one another. And certainly this is not to suggest that Australia's frontiers weren't by nature sites of interracial connection and familiarity, because of course they were. The very fact of that kind of close proximity created all sorts of conditions for contact, whether that was good or bad. But on frontiers where settlers were more dependent upon Aboriginal labour, so Aboriginal people became enfolded more quickly into colonial societies through kind of economic endeavours. That higher degree of cross-cultural exchange could create more opportunities for investigating violence, and meant that frontier clashes could come to the notice of the legal system even when they took place on the distant fringes of pastoral lands. And this is significant because it opens onto the question of how the law responded to frontier violence when violence came into view. Now, a great deal has been written about the difficulties of legally regulating frontier violence when a culture of secrecy kept that violence out of official sight. Despite the principle that the law stretched to encompass the frontier and that it worked to ensure equality between black and white, a principle that was exemplified in these famous proclamation boards by Governor Arthur that were nailed around the trees as a pictorial message of or assurance of legal equality to Aboriginal people in the build-up to the Black War in Tasmania. Despite this idea, this principle wasn't lived out on any of Australia's frontiers, and in many ways this failure of the law to regulate violence was a feature of the perennial difficulties of investigating and prosecuting it on remote frontiers where private retributions could often be kept under the radar of official sight. But in circumstances where existing interconnections, like economic and social interconnections, increase the likelihood of investigating violence, that question shifts a bit from being one about the law's limitations in detecting violence to becoming a question about how, when violence came to their notice, legal authorities intervened to punish it. Now, rather than talking about this in the abstract, I'm going to relate to you a story, if you like, from one particularly fraught Australian frontier, and that's the northwest or Pilbara region of Western Australia, just in the last decade of the 19th century. Now, there's nothing particularly unique about the expressions of violence on this late colonial frontier. They weren't exceptional. But some core conditions combined here to create a kind of frontier culture that was both very racially permeable and also highly volatile. Even on the cusp of the 20th century, this was still a very elementary frontier. The settler population was numerically very thin, and it was, harsh country, but its scattered network of large pastoral stations took up absolutely vast tracts of Aboriginal country, including precious water sources. And in comparison to this relatively small body of settlers occupying big stretches of territory, the Aboriginal population was large, dispersed and mobile. Now, in this setting, Aboriginal people were perceived by settlers both as an indispensable labour force that they sought to bring inside the pastoral sector, with a scarcity of white labour, and as a perpetual threat that they sought to keep outside it. Stock theft was the most heavily policed form of Aboriginal crime, but as historians have often argued, stock theft wasn't just a vital means of subsistence for Aboriginal people as pastoralism came to dispossess them and to monopolise their lands. It also constituted an important form of economic warfare and resistance to settlement. So what colonial observers classified as Aboriginal crime might instead be read as Aboriginal responses to colonial incursion and their protection of their lands, their laws and their families. Now, into this northwestern frontier towards the end of 1892 came a colonial official called Charles Straker, a visiting inspector of Aborigines, who was charged with visiting a wide arc of pastoral stations in the region to assess the state of race relations. And his report, a very interesting report, described a very malleable state of contact. A good number of Aboriginal people had come into the stations, he wrote, and in fact all the pastoralists in the northwest were coming to rely upon their labour. But at the same time, this was a pastoral frontier marked by extensive social upheaval. Settler take-up of pastoral leases had increased exponentially through the 1880s, so settlement wasn't really developing until the 1880s. And by the early 1890s, when Straker visited, the rate of incomers was escalating again with the discovery of the goldfields. The potential for conflict on this developing frontier was extremely high. The region was densely occupied Aboriginal country, home to more than 24 language groups. Anthropologist Bill Day has mapped how the rapid spread of the cattle sector across this region generated an enforced Aboriginal migration that led to an intensity of territorial competition that amounted to what he calls a virtual state of war with settlers. Now, all this was noted in Straker's report. He noted this state of social upheaval, but importantly, he also noted that the line between those Aboriginal people who came into the pastoral stations and those who stayed out was extremely fluid. He wrote that the people who came down from the region of the Hamersley Range weren't stationary. He wrote that they roam about between the country of the ranges and the Ashburton River to the southwest, sometimes coming into pastoral stations temporarily for work and rations, but then leaving again for the ranges. And importantly, he also noted that the geographical centrality of the ranges, which as you can see in that kind of small image were very rugged, gave Aboriginal people the capacity to intersect with pastoral stations in a way that posed great risk to settlers because they could come down and access the large pastoral runs and then disappear again into the ranges where it was virtually impossible for Europeans to follow on horseback. He wrote, amongst local settlers, it's notorious that these natives kill sheep and cattle, besides making the natives who are employed very unsettled. One station owner told me he now refuses to allow them to camp on the runs or at any of the waterholes. So you can see the conditions for conflict, just behind that statement. In his view, these hills people, as they were called, Bunjima people, nurtured an intention to drive out all the whites. Now, on this volatile frontier, violence was a quotidian event. But I'm going to relay a particular account of intimate violence that begins with this press report from 1891, announcing a cold-blooded murder by the blacks. The victim, James Coppin, was employed as a stockman on a station near the Hamersley Range. He'd been killed by a party of so-called Hills blacks, Bunjima people, who'd come down from the range, and the ringleader was reported to be Kuprabidi, a Bunjima man also known to settlers as Billy. There might have been all kinds of triggers for this attack, but whatever they were, the station manager, John Pollitt, regarded it certainly as a direct attack upon his cattle and penned a letter to the press threatening to take the law into my own hands or else we shan't be able to live up here at all. And this was a very common refrain amongst frontier settlers. Taking the law into one's own hands was kind of constantly quoted as part of their complaint that legal methods failed to deter Aboriginal attacks on their property and that private retribution, or rough justice as it was often called, was the only way to teach a salutary lesson. Now, this attack on this stockman wasn't a particularly unusual frontier event, but a particularly intriguing detail of this press report, which, if you can read it, is in the last line, is that having killed the stockman, Kuprabidi stole his gun and stated an intention to make his way to the Ashburton River to shoot Denis Bresnahan, against whom he has an old grudge. Now, there's nothing further to illuminate this fragment of personal enmity, but around it a much wider and much deeper history of intimate frontier violence comes into view. Denis Bresnahan, this is not actually his grave, but it is the grave of his brother in the Bresnahan family plot at Ashburton Downs Station. Denis Bresnahan was manager of the vast cattle station Ashburton Downs, located on the relatively lush country of the Ashburton River, just southwest of the range. And this station alone absorbed more than 3,000 square kilometres of Aboriginal land. So, you know, these stations were absolutely huge. Like his pastoralist neighbours, Bresnahan often experienced Aboriginal attacks on his stock and sometimes his station workers. For instance, in a single sitting at Roebourne Police Station, no fewer than 18 Aboriginal men appeared together on charges of killing his cattle, for which each man received a year's imprisonment with hard labour. So, you know, taken together, that's 18 years for killing a few head of cattle. But as his neighbour John Pollitt's letter to the press indicated, despite the fact that the police were in a constant round of patrols and local magistrates were in a constant round of in sending Aboriginal prisoners down for periods of incarceration on stock theft charges, settler sentiment tended to the view that legal punishments were inadequate as a deterrent, and taking the law into one's own hands was really the only effective course of action. Now, these kinds of conditions were indicative of the triggers that produced or generated frontier conflict of the kind that was endemic across Australia's frontiers more broadly, but that was often never actually capturable by the law. It was only recorded in private memoirs or journals that were either published well after the event, as in this account on the left, or in private memoirs and journals that were hidden away in family papers, like these other accounts. But on a porous frontier like the Northwest, such frontier clashes could and did come directly to the attention of authorities. On the official record, Denis Bresnahan was involved in 2 such clashes that resulted in the fatal shooting of no fewer than 5 Aboriginal men and the wounding of several others. Now, importantly, this wasn't violence against strangers who came again, together and then parted again from across a divided frontier. This was close-range violence that involved Aboriginal men with whom Bresnahan claimed to be familiar, and it was violence of a kind that brought the legal system into direct play. So the question is how, under these kinds of circumstances, the legal system responded to it. The first of these events occurred when Bresnahan was out patrolling with police on the far reaches of Ashburton Downs Station, and remember this is 3,000 square kilometres. He was assisting the police in identifying Aboriginal suspects of cattle theft. According to him in his later deposition, he'd separated from the police when he came across an Aboriginal man he recognised as Nanamara, someone he'd previously caught, he said, attempting to steal the cattle. When Nanamara began running away from him, he pursued him and a struggle occurred in which he accidentally shot Nanamara dead. Now, this event occurred while Bresnahan was out accompanying police, and Nanamara's death was duly reported to the local magistrate for report to the Attorney General. There was a web of magistrates representing government across the northwest, and all of their reports went back to the Attorney General. The magistrate noted that Bresnahan wasn't authorised to apprehend Nanamara, and he also noted that the police on this occasion didn't hold any warrants for making any Aboriginal arrests. This was actually very common in police patrols to not have warrants. Nonetheless, he determined that Bresnahan's shooting of Nanamara was a case of self-defence and that no further investigation was required. Receiving this report, the Attorney General was more concerned that it reflected a pattern of settlers and police pursuing Aboriginal suspects on the basis of little evidence. He suggested that this case was indicative, quote, of what's taking place too often. The white man's property is stolen and he and the police go out for what? Nominally to arrest the black criminal. There's the farce of going to identify this black criminal, but the identifiers make for the first natives they see running away. In this case, what reasonable evidence is there that this native had anything to do with the killing of these cattle? So the magistrate was asked to, respond, and he replied that there was every evidence because in his deposition, Bresnahan had stated that he'd previously found Nanamara committing a similar crime, and the police constable he was with deposed that Nanamara was also known to them as a ringleader of a previous attack on the cattle. So he settled his report by saying, under these circumstances, I abstain from taking any action against Denis Bresnahan, a decision that was accepted by the Attorney General. So in effect, Bresnahan's and the police's stated familiarity with Nanamara as an alleged cattle killer served to substitute for any evidence of a crime and closed off any further investigation into the illegalities of a circumstance where a settler could go out with the police with no warrants and fatally shoot an Aboriginal man committing no greater offence than running away. A couple of aspects of this event stand out in reflecting a wider pattern of this kind of frontier violence. Firstly, the participants in this encounter, Nanamara, Bresnahan and the police constable, weren't part of a singular or one-off event. They were connected together in a longer cycle of fraught encounters that revolved around cattle theft and its reprisals. And secondly, in this cycle of reprisals, settlers didn't necessarily act beyond the sight of police. They were entailed with the police in a paramilitary model of patrolling the frontier that also included the employment of armed Aboriginal trackers who bridged both worlds. And although the police were always cautioned that they were a civil, not a military body, they still had wide latitude to use their arms for legal cause. As the Attorney General put it, it's impossible to lay down the law with absolute precision, but if there be any principle in these doubtful matters, it is that not more force should be used than necessary. Now, for settlers, as for police, this interpretable space of necessity left open the capacity for applying mitigating arguments at every turn. While Bresnahan's shooting of Nanamurra was initially questioned by legal officials, it was ultimately accommodated as being legally justified on grounds of self-defence. And this was a mitigating argument that often served in colonial Australia to save settlers from prosecution for Aboriginal deaths. So in effect, Bresnahan's pursuit and killing of Nanamurra was no different in substance to the more secretive or covert forms of violence that occurred beyond the law's range of sight. But even when such acts were subjected to legal scrutiny, as was the case here, they could still be turned from illegal acts to acts that showed legal cause. Some of these same features were apparent in the second episode involving Bresnahan 3 years later. According to police files, Bresnahan and some of his men were out mustering cattle, again on the far borders of Ashburton Downs Station, when they were reportedly attacked by the natives. There was a clash in which Bresnahan and his party shot dead 4 Aboriginal men and wounded several others whose fate wasn't recorded. After this affray, they captured a group of 9 men whom they claimed to recognise as cattle stealers. They trekked these men back in chains to be tried by the local Justice of the Peace. By the way, honorary positions that were always occupied by local pastoralists. And the Justice of the Peace found them guilty of cattle theft and sentenced most of them to a year's imprisonment with hard labour. And amongst the prisoners captured from this affray was Bresnahan's old foe, Cooper Biddy. Along with 3 others, Cooper Biddy was tried for James Coppen's murder from the previous year, and shortly afterwards Cooper Biddy became the first man to be hanged at Roebourne Jail. And Roebourne Jail is now an historic precinct, but this is the same building that you saw before with the Aboriginal prisoners' neck chained standing in front of it. Cooper Biddy's execution can be compared to the relative dearth of settlers in the history of colonial Australia who were ever tried and found guilty for the murder of Aboriginal people. Historians have often noted that in the early decades of Australian settlement, colonial judiciaries were profoundly uncertain about whether Aboriginal people could really be considered amenable to the law, and so they were very uncertain about whether Aboriginal people could be prosecuted for capital crimes. So up until the 1830s, there were very few Aboriginal people prosecuted for capital crimes in colonial Australia. But even after the mid-1830s, when London's Colonial Office insisted that they came within the pale of British law as the Queen's subjects and that they must enjoy its protection, Australia's colonial courts rarely prosecuted, let alone punished, settler violence against them. And as I've already said, this is partly explained by the difficulties of securing evidence in frontier environments where limited legal resources and a culture of settler solidarity hampered investigations and prevented prosecutions from taking place. But even when an extensive network of police posts and magistrates and local courts created a web of government representation across the frontier, as was at least partly the case on the northwest. Remember, this is the last decade of the 19th century. It doesn't necessarily follow that the criminal legal system worked to meet an official policy of equality. At the time of Cooper Biddy's execution in 1892, only 1 man in the colony's history who was an ex-convict was executed for Aboriginal murder, that is a white man, while by this stage, more than 24 Aboriginal men had already been executed for the murder of whites. Because as another indicator of this, 5 years before the stockman James Coppen had been killed, his employer, John Pollitt, he'd written the letter to the press saying, we have to take the law into our own hands, had shot and killed Jennaquarry, an Aboriginal man who'd once been employed as a shepherd on a neighbouring station but had returned to the range and was now visiting Pollitt's station. This shooting was witnessed by station workers, so there was nothing hidden about it. Pollitt duly reported it to the local magistrate. And in his deposition, he said that Jennaquarry's presence had unsettled his own Aboriginal workers, so he was in the process of ordering him off the station when his horse jolted and his gun accidentally discharged. But in other contradicting depositions, his Aboriginal station workers stated that Pollitt had raised his gun and fired deliberately from the shoulder with an intent to shoot Janaquari. Nonetheless, the magistrate determined that the case was one of accidental homicide, for which Pollitt was awarded a fine of £5. As in Bresnahan's shooting of Nanamurra, the Attorney-General receiving this report was sufficiently concerned by the Aboriginal testimony to send it back for a second inquiry. But the second inquiry yielded the same findings as the first, accidental homicide, and there the case was laid to rest. Now, each of these episodes reflects a model of the contested frontier as a close space of interconnected conflicts rather than a distant space where strangers met and parted from across the cultural divide. John Pollitt shot Janaquari apparently because, as partly insider and partly outsider, Janaquari unsettled Pollitt's control over his own Aboriginal workers. And in the more distant clashes that took place on the far borders of the pastoral station, Bresnahan, either in company with his workers or in company with the police, fatally shot several Aboriginal men whom they or the police claimed to know as suspects in an ongoing cycle of stock theft and reprisals. And most importantly, these events were all reported to local magistrates and were considered by legal authorities at the centre of government, and were still shaped to fit legally justifiable terms that supported the protection of settler investments. Certainly in the legal history of colonial Australia, explanations of self-defence and accidental homicide were commonly used as extenuating factors to excuse settler responsibility for Aboriginal deaths. So in this respect, the northwest frontier wasn't particularly unique in reflecting a pattern of legal exceptionalism around these matters, but the increased opportunities for reportage and investigation of violence on this very racially entangled frontier just highlights that pattern. But Bresnahan's story also raises another kind of legal exceptionalism that was part of managing the pastoral frontier, and that was the category of special constable. Various police acts in Australia's colonies included the provision that ordinary settlers could be temporarily sworn in to act as police, and this was a very useful strategy on remote frontier where police numbers were thin, because it helped to bolster their manpower. But this flexible capacity for settlers to act as police also had the potential to bring privatised violence within the framework of the law. The most notorious of these occasions in the history of the Northwest was the Flying Foam Massacre, when, in response to the spearing of a police constable, Roebourne's magistrate swore in two parties of settlers under very loosely worded instructions to disperse those resisting the law, and this led to the massacre of an estimated 60 Aboriginal people. Now, Bresnahan wasn't sworn in as a special constable on the two occasions when he was on record for fatally shooting Aboriginal men, including when he was out with police identifying cattle killing suspects. But he had officially served in this capacity before, when the local magistrate authorised him to lead an expedition against Aboriginal suspects who'd attacked one of his shepherds. And once again, this had been an attack that reflected the very knotted relationships of a fluid frontier, where the boundaries between the pastoral station and the other side of the frontier were very blurred. Bresnahan's shepherd, who was injured but not killed in this attack, identified amongst his attackers an Aboriginal co-worker, a man who Bresnahan had employed as a shepherd, but who had left to return to the range with so-called outside natives. The party of special constables led by Bresnahan that went in pursuit of these suspects returned after almost a month, and there's no record of what they did while they were out scouring the region, but a press report on this case alluded to the tacitly understood nature of such expeditions by suggesting that, quote, if the natives in the present instance aren't dealt with severely and the whole tribe punished, there'll be more trouble and more blood spilt. So, as some of these episodes have already indicated, the potential for violence was as present inside the social world of the pastoral station as it was on or beyond its boundaries. In 1889, Sub-Inspector of Police Patrick Troy was tasked with touring the northwest to investigate the treatment of Aboriginal workers in the pastoral sector. And one employer he singled out for mention in his report was Denis Bresnahan. Troy had interviewed one of Bresnahan's Aboriginal workers, Harry, who said that the Aboriginal station hands were often running away, and when that occurred, Bresnahan went in pursuit of them and drove them back with a whip. According to Harry, Bresnahan wasn't above using Aboriginal women as a bartering tool to keep his Aboriginal workers on the station, giving a girl to his station boys even when she had another lawful husband. Reading Troy's report, the Governor made a marginal note that men such as Bresnahan require to be watched, but despite this official notice, it was only a few weeks later that authorities would discuss and dismiss Bresnahan's fatal shooting of Nanamurra on the border of his pastoral station on grounds of self-defence. Harry's statement to the police also opens onto the possible undocumented causes of Cooper Biddy's reported grudge against Bresnahan, the point at which this story began. Quite possibly, Bresnahan's abuse of Aboriginal workers and his violation of traditional laws around marriage made him a target for retribution from across the other side of a frontier, where the line between Aboriginal people who came in and those who stayed out was very fluid. But although Troy singled him out for special mention, Bresnahan wasn't unusual in using the lash to control Aboriginal workers. The flogging of Aboriginal workers by settler masters was a familiar feature of frontier labour relationships, and to some degree it was accepted by colonial officials as normative practice, but when it went beyond a certain point, settlers could be prosecuted for assault, and were on several occasions when they flogged Aboriginal servants to death. But this was also a practice that brought the legal ambiguities of frontier violence inside the pastoral station into sharp relief. While the private flogging of Aboriginal workers was formally prohibited by the law, under 1892 amendments to the Aborigines Offenders Act, Aboriginal floggings could be awarded as a summary punishment by any frontier magistrate or justice of the peace. So, like the legal provision of special constables, which enabled settlers to kind of stand in as police, the availability of flogging as a judicial punishment for Aboriginal prisoners blurred the line between private or illegal acts of violence committed by settlers and lawful forms of punishment applied by the colonial state. Now, in this account of violence on one particular Australian frontier, Denis Bresnahan appears to stand out as a singular figure, but there's nothing particularly unique about him other than that his activities survive in police and colonial office records. Instead, the personal histories of these people from both sides of the frontier help to illustrate how frontier race relations unfolded in a very ambiguous space between an official policy that Aboriginal people were equal in the eyes of the law as subjects of the Crown, and the practical realities of volatile colonial frontiers where they patently were not. As recurring figures in a series of violent encounters, Bresnahan and Cooper Biddy perhaps personify the nature of frontier conflict in an environment where competing cultural and territorial interests played out in close range proximity, were symptomatic of a still evolving colonial world where Aboriginal people moved sometimes as insiders and sometimes as outsiders, and where settlers could, above all, expect the support of the legal network of police and magistrates in protecting their economic investments. In contrast to Bresnahan, Aboriginal men like Cooper Biddy and Nanamurra remain shadowy figures in the colonial archive, always relegated to the position of murderer or cattle killer. But even then, their assertions of their own rights and their own laws might be glimpsed in fragmentary ways within the archival record. And although their motivations can only be speculated upon, it's clear that their relationship to settler culture was a very complex one that involved a capacity to move across the boundaries between the pastoral world and the other side of the frontier. And in fact, it was this very capacity for mobility that made settlers most anxious about the threat that Aboriginal people posed to pastoral security, and that undoubtedly helped to fuel the kind of aggressive settler culture that still pertained on this northwestern frontier, at least even into the early 20th century. And ultimately, this kind of violence, which was violence closely entwined with cross-cultural connectedness, this didn't necessarily reflect the pattern of frontier warfare that remained largely concealed or concealable from colonial authorities. Instead, here the legal system was called into motion by shifting economic and social links between settlers and Aboriginal people that didn't necessarily diminish frontier conflict, but might actually bring it to the surface. And it was precisely under these kinds of conditions that forms of legal exceptionalism came into play that rendered as legally acceptable acts that would otherwise be defined as criminal offences. So in this sense, the problem of regulating frontier violence, which marked the history of all of Australia's colonial frontiers, wasn't just a question of how violence could be brought within the law's reach and thereby regulated. It was also a question about how it could be made intelligible in legal terms and neutralised as a condition of colonial settlement. Thank you.